Confessions of a Mummified Cat. Yes, I was a god once. Now I'm a paperweight. Not literally, mind you, though I did serve that inglorious purpose for 3 months in Professor Hartwell's office until someone finally noticed the graduate students were using my sacred form to hold down their dissertation drafts. The irony was not lost on me. 2,000 years of careful preservation only to be crushed beneath the socio-economic impact of grain distribution in 3rd Dynasty Memphis. I've endured grave robbers, colonial collectors, and museum curators, but nothing quite prepared me for the indignity of supporting a thesis about my own civilization's agricultural policies. Allow me to introduce myself properly. I am, or was, Khenti-Ka-Tet, which translates roughly to "he who goes forward into the sacred place." The humans who mummified me were far more poetic than your modern taxonomists who labeled me simply as Felis Catus, adult male, dynasty 68th, provenance uncertain. Provenance uncertain, as if my entire existence could be reduced to a geographical question mark. I lived in the temple of Bastet in Bubastis, back when the Nile ran clear and the gods still took house calls. Those were the days when a cat's word meant something, when we were consulted on matters of state and treated with the respect befitting our divine nature. I remember the morning rituals, priests prostrating themselves as I padded across the cool limestone floors, my golden collar catching the first rays of Ra's chariot. The scent of frankincense and fresh fish, always fresh fish, permeated the air. Sacred duties included blessing the harvest, cursing enemies of the pharaoh, and the occasional prophecy delivered through the arcane art of knocking pottery off high shelves. My death, I must confess, was rather anticlimactic for a deity. No dramatic plague, no heroic sacrifice to save Egypt from invading armies. I simply ate something that disagreed with me, likely that questionable ibis the new acolyte brought in. One moment I was contemplating the eternal mysteries of existence and the positioning of the food bowl. The next I was experiencing what humans romantically call crossing over into the blessed afterlife, but which felt remarkably similar to the worst stomach upset in recorded history. The mummification process was, I'm told, exemplary. 70 days of careful preparation during which my organs were removed and stored in appropriately cat-sized canopic jars. A thoughtful touch, really. They wrapped me in the finest linen, painted my bandages with protective hieroglyphs, and enclosed me in a gilded sarcophagus shaped like a seated cat. For centuries, I rested peacefully in my tomb, listening to the distant sounds of Egypt's rise and fall, the rhythm of sandstorms, and the occasional disturbed bat. Then came the archaeologists. Professor Nigel Blackthorne, a name that should have immediately suggested villainy, discovered my resting place in 1847. I'll give him credit. He handled the initial excavation with proper reverence. But Blackthorne was, as I later learned, what the British called a gentleman scholar, which apparently meant wealthy amateur with delusions of academic grandeur. He smuggled me out of Egypt in a crate labeled agricultural specimens alongside several mislabeled pottery shards and one genuinely sacred scarab beetle who never stopped complaining about the accommodations. The journey to London was harrowing. Ships in those days were not designed with ancient artifacts in mind. I spent 6 weeks in the cargo hold listening to rats debate the finer points of grain theft while water seeped through the hullboards. By the time we reached Portsmouth, my wrappings had developed an alarming case of mold, and the beetle had developed what I can only describe as acute agoraphobia. Blackthorne's London townhouse was my next stop, where I spent a delightful 18 months displayed in his Egyptian room, alongside a collection of other pilfered artifacts. The dinner parties were endless sources of entertainment. Victorian gentlemen would peer at me through their monocles, pontificating about the mysterious ways of the ancients, while completely missing the fact that the nearby papyrus scroll was being used as a coaster for their brandy snifters. I particularly enjoyed watching them debate my religious significance, while someone's corgi gnawed thoughtfully on what they believed to be a sacred amulet, but was actually Blackthorne's door key wrapped in old bandages. When Blackthorne died, peacefully, I might add, despite his flagrant disrespect for the curses inscribed on half his collection, I was sold to Mrs. Evangeline Pemberton, a widow with an obsession for all things feline. Her Belgravia mansion housed 47 living cats, and after my arrival, one significantly dead one. Mrs. Pemberton was convinced I possessed mystical powers and consulted me on all major decisions, from stock investments to menu planning. She would sit before my display case for hours, asking profound questions like, should I serve the salmon mousse at Thursday's tea? And interpreting my eternal silence as cosmic wisdom. The living cats were less impressed. Duchess, a pampered Persian with delusions of aristocracy, considered my presence an affront to the natural order. She would sit directly in front of my case during Mrs. Pemberton's consultation sessions, fixing me with a stare that clearly communicated her opinion of gods who couldn't even catch their own mice. The tabby, Winston, showed more respect, possibly because he recognized a fellow philosopher when he saw one. Mrs. Pemberton's death, I'm beginning to sense a pattern here, led to an estate auction where I was purchased by the British Museum for the princely sum of £12.06. The museum years should have been my return to glory, a chance to educate the masses about the sophistication of ancient Egyptian civilization. Instead, I found myself in room 62, Egyptian funeral practices, positioned between a crocodile mummy that had seen better millennia and a collection of Shabti figures with identity crises. The museum guards, I discovered, were an eclectic bunch. There was Henderson, who practiced his Shakespeare monologues during night shifts, using me as his audience for increasingly dramatic renditions of Hamlet. His Yorick soliloquy was particularly ironic, given our setting. Then came Mrs. Dursley, who brought her knitting and would pause occasionally to ask my opinion on colour combinations for her grandson's jumper. I developed a deep appreciation for the texture of human conversation, even if I couldn't participate. But museums, like empires, rise and fall. Budget cuts led to reorganization, which led to storage, which led to the Great Confusion of 1987, when half the Egyptian collection was accidentally donated to a local charity shop. I wasn't among the donated, my paperwork was too complicated, but I was moved to the archive basement, where I spent 15 years surrounded by boxes labeled miscellaneous ancient stuff and really old things, do not touch. The basement years were actually quite contemplative. I had time to reflect on the nature of existence, the meaning of divinity, and whether the gods had anticipated their sacred representatives ending up next to a box of Victorian dentures and someone's abandoned PhD thesis on the metaphysical implications of ancient Egyptian toe jewelry. The thesis was actually quite insightful, though the author clearly hadn't consulted any actual ancient Egyptians. My current situation began when Dr. Sarah Chen, a graduate student in archaeological studies, discovered me during a routine inventory of forgotten artifacts requiring reassessment. She recognized my significance immediately, finally, a human with proper education, and petitioned to include me in her research on religious practices and animal mummification in the late period. I was hopeful this might lead to a proper display, perhaps even a placard mentioning my divine nature. Instead, I ended up here, in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet in the university's archaeology department, sharing space with what I'm told is a pharaoh's toe, but which I suspect is actually a dried apricot that someone mislabeled decades ago. The toe, or apricot, doesn't talk much, which is just as well. Bad enough to be stored with bureaucratic efficiency. Worse to be stored with fraudulent produce. The graduate students occasionally open the drawer, usually late at night, when they're either desperate for research material or under the influence of substances that weren't available in ancient Egypt. Last month, one young man named Trevor became convinced I was communicating with him telepathically. He spent 3 hours asking me questions about his love life, interpreting my silence as cosmic approval for his pursuit of the philosophy major with the nose ring. I admit, after 2 millennia of observation, I've developed some opinions about human relationships, but they're hardly the sort of thing one shares with someone who refers to me as the spooky cat thing. The irony of my situation isn't lost on me. Once I was worshipped as a vessel of Bastet herself, guardian of home and hearth, protector of the sacred mysteries. Humans traveled hundreds of miles to seek my blessing. Now I'm lucky if someone remembers to dust off my case every few months. The transformation from deity to curiosity to forgotten relic is perhaps the most thorough form of mortality ever devised. Yet I find myself oddly philosophical about it all. Immortality, as it turns out, is less about lasting forever and more about lasting long enough to see everything change. I've watched empires crumble, religions evolve, and humans discover that the earth revolves around